One theme that emerged in talking to both of you is actually the different takes that you have to this, the crisis and how we're going to actually get out. So we have, Effie, you're in Zurich, and Jeff, you're in Baltimore, and you're both really at the forefront of, this idea of public health and the forging of public policy. And I've noticed that you're both sort of working different angles in some way. Effie, you were talking about what's actually happening in Switzerland now with the development of the app and the use of it. And Jeff, you were sort of surprised that they were that far along and so on. So this prompts a question, and I'm just wondering, where we are in terms of a global conversation about these kinds of questions. Will these things just be worked out, in national or perhaps regional basis, and then we'll sort of see what happens, and there'll be kind of a best practices emerging? Or is there any kind of global conversation about the uses of digital technology, the idea of immunity certificates, or are these things just happening in isolation? Effie, maybe we'll go to you first.
Sure. It's interesting to see that as the pandemic, where it started, like if you're going from east towards west, the conversations followed the same path. So in fact, amongst the first countries to even come up with those apps were China and then Singapore. Now in Europe, we're next because we were the next ones in line in this trajectory of the disease. So we were the next ones to talk about it, and we had already seen what China or what Singapore did, and I think the United States was a little later in what happened. So maybe there's a chronological element here, but in fact, the country that now has just released about 2 weeks ago the digital proximity tracing app was Singapore. That's with the technology that is supposed to be more privacy preserving than others. So we've seen that here. We haven't yet seen one in Europe, but we're very close to that. As I mentioned to you earlier, Switzerland has announced that we will have one on the 11th of May. We don't know details about it, but we know that we'll have one. So yes, countries are at different stages in the epidemic and also in their response. But I think they're converging towards the fact that they're going to be using those technologies. I think every country, if you look at in any strategy, exit strategy or transition strategy, you're seeing discussions about those tools. So it means we'll have them in some form or shape. In terms of global conversation, there is discussion in Europe about common standards. It didn't go very well, that discussion, even in that context, where we have different groups doing different technological solutions, but at least we have, it is in the radar of people who have to have some sort of common standard here. And interoperability of some of those, because keep in mind that we would need them not just to get out of our houses, but we'll need it in order to travel. And there we would need to move around countries, different jurisdictions, and different technological solutions. And perhaps it's of interest that the World Health Organization is having conversations on these matters. They're working towards some technical standard that countries then can use to develop their technologies. And they're also working on some governance and sort of ethical requirements guidance that, again, could help countries maybe align to the extent possible in how to govern the technologies that they're using. So that's as far as the consensus or convergence that I am seeing right now.
Yeah, and even since we last talked about this, Joel, which was, I don't know, a few days ago, there is now a kind of much more urgent conversation in the US about digital contact tracing. And I have recruited Effie to help us with a project we're doing here. And I'm on another similar webinar very early for me on Friday morning with folks in the UK. So that I think the academic discussions, well, maybe academic plus policy plus relevant expert discussions, is starting to happen much more globally. That said, the conversations then need to be brought back and filtered and interpreted, applied through the systems where they would need to be implemented. And one of the interesting kind of political and governance questions is, how different will the implementation need to be based on the different systems in which we live, right? And there's a kind of geopolitical question too about whether one system is going to prove itself stronger, better for dealing with these sorts of outbreaks, and what the implications of that might be on a kind of geopolitical level. There was a story about this morning on Morning Edition on NPR, asking exactly that question. It's a fascinating question, but of course one we won't know the answer to for a while.